Good morning, everyone. It is April the 5th, 2011, in Fairhope, Alabama. We are in the Fairhope Public Library, and we have the distinct privilege of a moment to talk with a distinguished veteran, Jonathan Leff. Jonathan is going to tell us his story of how he first came to the military, his experience with training in the military, and his experience after or during his career as a military officer. And we will begin by and one thing that I would like to accomplish here. 50 years from now, you and I may not be here, and somebody's going to watch this, hopefully. And hopefully they can draw from your experience that you're about to share. If we accomplish that, that is what the Veterans History Project aims to do. And if it works out, maybe the Naval Academy will share this with some young midshipmen as well.
We shall see.
So with that, you had mentioned earlier, let's start with your childhood and how you got to the Navy.
In 1935, I was 13. I saw a movie called Shipmates Forever, starring Dick Powell and Ruby Keeler. And it was all about Annapolis, the Naval Academy. And thereafter, I was committed. I had to go to the Naval Academy. And I directed my high school education as best I could toward those courses that would help me pass the entrance examinations. In 1939, then, I wanted to get an appointment to the academy. And in those years, at least, and I don't know a lot of what's going on now, in those years, one was appointed to the academy, in most cases, by a member of Congress. And each senator and representative had, at any one time, 4 appointments to each of the service academies: Annapolis, West Point, and Coast Guard, I believe. I don't think
the Air Force was not.
And the Air Force Academy didn't exist at that time. And most members of Congress, instead of selecting an individual, a young man, and in those days, of course, it was all male. There were no women. And today, I understand upwards of a quarter or a third of the student population are women.
That is correct.
In those days, members of Congress tried to avoid selecting an individual to receive an appointment, because while it might make the individual and the individual's family happy, it could make a lot of other individuals and their families who voted unhappy. And so they turned that over to the Civil Service Commission, who gave competitive exams every year. We lived in Arizona. My senator was Carl Hayden, and he had an appointment available. I went into Phoenix to the federal building to take the exam for the Naval Academy. The proctor proposed that I take the exam for West Point also. I said, I don't want to go to West Point. I want to go to Annapolis. He said, the exams are the same, except West Point has one additional exam in ancient history. You might enjoy it. And I had done well in ancient history, so I decided to do it. I came in first for West Point and second for Annapolis.
Congratulations.
I turned down West Point, as we midshipmen used to call it. And my father, who was a physician, a country doctor, he drove me to visit the young man who received the principal appointment. And my father eyed him and said, he'll pass the physical. You're not going to get in this year. Then what to do? I learned that there were no other appointments to the Naval Academy the following year from any of the 3 members of the Arizona delegation. But then I also learned that up to 100 enlisted men, and again it was all men in those days, up to 100 enlisted men could gain entrance to the Naval Academy through supposedly a competitive examination. So with my parents' permission, I went to enlist and learned that the quota, this is now the June 1939 quota, was filled for our region, and I couldn't get in. I would have to wait a year. I then learned who was in charge of recruiting for that region. There was a commander, I think his name was Sauer, S-A-U-E-R, in San Diego. I telephoned and got an appointment to talk with him. My mother and I took the train to San Diego.
Really?
We went to his office. My mother, thank goodness, maintained a discreet silence. I pleaded my case, and he opened up the quota and let me in. But that wasn't quite enough. So I was enlisted. I was in boot camp, 10 weeks of boot camp, which was the last time there were 10 weeks for recruits. It was reduced to 6 weeks. Even then, in 1939, they were already starting to accelerate, to recognize the possible need for a larger Navy.
Where was your boot camp?
San Diego.
San Diego.
And while I was in boot camp, I came down with what was called cat fever, catarrhal fever, which was, I guess, the Navy talk in those days for flu. And I was hospitalized. And then I was told, because I had lost so much time, I could not go back to my group. I would have to go to the next group, which again would disable my getting into the academy. You had to have 1 year of service as an enlisted man to be able to get in. So I pleaded my case again with the lieutenant in charge, and he let me go back to my group. I was then sent, when I finished boot camp, to the USS West Virginia, which again was one of the newer old battleships, West Virginia, Colorado, and the Maryland. And I was an enlisted man on the West Virginia. We had two experiences, I would say, that was outstanding. One was when we attacked in the greatest amphibious operation in history, Monterey, California. There was the Weavy, the West Virginia, and maybe the Colorado. I cannot remember what ships were involved, a few. And 3 or 4 Army transports. And the vehicles used to carry the troops into the beach in this assault on Monterey were 50-foot motor launches. The boats that Frank Sinatra and Gene Kelly would go back and forth in the movies about the Navy. To carry the light tanks that were used, treads were put across the seats. I was in the boat crew, stern hook. We went alongside an Army transport. There was a cargo net hanging down, and the troops came down with their World War I helmets and Springfield rifles from World War I, filled the boat. We got ready to go. The engineer started up. It stopped. It seemed that the cargo net was too long, was hanging down too far, and wound itself around the propeller of the boat. And that was the end of my experience attacking Monterey, California. We went over the side with a hatchet, with a knife, with a saw. Finally, that didn't work. We were all brought up then this was very cold. I think it was
Yes.
December.
Water's cold.
We were put to bed, and I, not quite 18, was given a shot of whiskey, which was very, very impressive. The other noteworthy thing about my enlisted career was when the fleet had moved out to Pearl Harbor to stay. We were out in the Pacific somewhere, and we were practicing being fueled at sea. And this involved a tanker coming alongside, or we coming alongside the tanker. And then with booms and hoses and all, a large hose came over from the tanker, was attached to the deck, near the deck of the West Virginia. And we were steaming along pleasantly. It was a Sunday, the officers were in their white uniforms. And the hose parted at the deck, and oil, #2 bunker, I guess, sprayed all over the West Virginia's turret 3 and turret 4, and the officers in their white uniforms, and the decks, which we enlisted men then had to holy stone for days and days and days and days. I took the exam in February 1940 aboard ship. I was one of 66, I think, enlisted men who, out of the 100 spots that were available, only 66 of us passed, and we went to the academy. All 66 of us graduated, which was quite a feat, because I would say something on the order of 250 to 300 young men didn't graduate out of our class. This was the class of 44. So now I was at the academy, and the first days, of course, were very exciting. Being sworn in on the steps of Memorial Hall was thrilling. Plebe year was plebe year, and I don't know what it's like today, but then it was an experience. I tried to resign twice during the year because I wanted to join the Royal Canadian Air Force and go shoot down Nazis. And twice my battalion commander talked me out of it, thank goodness. But I had written away for the application forms and all, and I was pretty serious about that. At the academy, I'm trying to think of what noteworthy exploits.
It took you 3 years to get through that.
Ah, yes. The course was shortened from 4 years to 3. I worked on the Log, which was the weekly magazine. I was news editor. I graduated in the top 80% of my class, which is one way to put it. At least I wasn't in the lower 20%, but I was close. I don't know what else to say about the, oh yes, at the academy, Pearl Harbor. On December 7th, I was in the watch squad, but off watch, and I was lying in my bunk listening to a football game, of course, and suddenly the radio stopped and the voice, and there was silence, and I thought my roommate had come in and turned it off, and I said, "What did you do that for?" And then the voice came on and announced the attack on Pearl Harbor. Immediately, we in the watch squad went down to the rotunda and were issued 45 automatics to defend Bancroft Hall from the Japanese. We were instructed on how to handle the 45 automatics, and particularly when relieving the watch or being relieved of the watch, That is, you drop the clip, you then work the chamber, nothing is in there, and then you pull the trigger. And we midshipmen were responsible for patrolling the basement, Bancroft Hall, thereafter. And every once in a while, in the night, you would hear, boom!
Whoa.
You knew what that meant, but no one was hurt. We were taught never aim the gun at anybody unless you want to kill them. When we graduated, am I allowed to go on now?
Go.
Curious thing, the course was accelerated to 3 years, except for those going into submarines, our roommate, for example, and lighter than air, blimp pilots. The rest of us were sent to Florida for 10 weeks of naval air indoctrination training.
We're in Florida. Jacksonville?
2 weeks in Jacksonville, Melbourne, Daytona, name it. Wherever there were naval air stations, there would be torpedo bombers at one place, dive bombers at other, fighters, and so on. Jacksonville was 2 weeks when we took a course in naval air gunnery, starting with shooting skeet and trap with shotguns, not doing very well, and then suddenly putting a big sight on the shotgun and getting every one of them, and learning to lead, in other words, when shooting. But what was curious was this really country club life. This was now 1943, the middle of the war, and we spent 10 weeks in Florida. And I never really learned what was behind this. One theory was that even then, recognizing that air power was the future of the Navy, it was to indoctrinate us. But I didn't think that was satisfactory. And I wondered whether it was more a matter of not having available ships for us to go to. I just don't know. But after Florida, I was sent to the Maryland, which was a sister ship of the West Virginia and the Colorado. I was a passenger on the Essex, which was at that time the greatest aircraft carrier in the world. We were passengers to go out to Pearl to our ships, some 400 of us. As we went under the bridge, the captain got on the bullhorn and said, "This is the captain speaking. We are underway for Pearl Harbor without an escort. We will stop for nothing. Keep clear of the lifelines."
Okay.
And it was really one big poker game. Well, there was many poker games all the way to Pearl Harbor. On the Maryland, I was assigned to the F Division, Fire Control, principally involved with controlling the 16-inch guns. The Maryland had 4 turrets of 2 16-inch guns each. I was the junior plotting room officer, the plotting room being in the bowels of the ship. My boss was a lieutenant, awfully nice guy, and I was his assistant. And my function was ballistics officer. It was my job to determine how each of those 8 guns should be corrected to be able to aim and hit the designated target, taking into consideration many, many, many factors. When was the last time this rifle, so-called, was rebored? How many times has it been fired since then? And what was it fired with? Armor piercing or high capacity? Plus the temperature, the humidity, the wind speed, many, many things. And I set up a board on a piece of plywood with all of these several factors and the data that I needed to be able to handle them.
You were good at calculus. Had to be.
Not since then. We first went down to, this is now 1943, got to the ship around September something. We went down to Guadalcanal, to Florida Island, where we joined up with all of the other vessels with which we were going to take Tarawa. Tarawa, for me, meant being down in the main battery plotting room and seeing very little of what went on up above. Because when we were shooting, I was down there. On the few occasions I got topside, it was my first experience to see what I saw, which were the bodies of Marines floating back and forth with the tides. Tarawa, as perhaps many know, was not a great success for our forces. We did not have adequate information, we didn't have adequate charts. What we did have on the Maryland was the admiral in charge and Navajo code whisperers.
Really?
And one went ashore with the colonel, whose name I don't remember. And the other was on the ship, and they were able to communicate with each other in Navajo, and impossible for any Japanese or most Occidentals to decipher. Colonel Carlson of Carlson Raiders was on board as an observer. He was supposed to be going back to San Diego to get his own division. He never got it. He was a renegade as far as the Navy bureaucracy was concerned, because of the intimacy with which he and his men maintained their fighting prowess. In any event, Tarawa involved a lot of shooting. We'd get up at 4 in the morning, have steak for breakfast, and we'd be shooting before dawn. And then finally, when matters were secured, we left. Next came Kwajalein. I should point out that during this time, in the times when I was not shooting, but in the main battery plotting room on watch or waiting, the enlisted men in the plotting room introduced me to Pinochle. And they had a real patsy there. But I got even with them when we went to general quarters. We officers had to put on our .45 automatics. And I explained to the men that the reason I was wearing that gun, that weapon, was to make sure who got out of there first. Kwajalein. We had 2 float planes, spotting planes mainly, on board, which we would catapult off. And at Kwajalein, we were shooting away with high capacity, which were mainly making big explosions, but not penetrating. One of our spotters reported that there was a blockhouse in Kwajalein that was giving the Marines a lot of trouble, and we really needed to go after it with high capacity, with armor piercing. So I set to work figuring out and we would fire one gun from one turret. And I figured out exactly what we should put on that gun to hit. And I checked it and rechecked it. And I was doing this as we pulled back to about 5 miles, I guess. The idea of pulling back was to enable us to shoot up and then come down with these armor-piercing projectiles. So I gave my boss my numbers. And he never learned this. And he put a Jesus factor on it. He corrected my correction. And gave it back to me. And I took it off, his Jesus factor. I was so confident and cocky in those days, and I was so sure of my numbers that I went with mine, but I didn't tell him. We fired and immediately reloaded, the assumption being we'd have to fire again. And the message came, cease fire, you got a direct hit. And I could never tell my boss that I had done this. So only I and very few friends and my family and now you know that I did this.
Thank you for sharing that with us.
The Admiral, I think it was Harry Hill, told our captain that if he would like to send some gunnery officers ashore to see our handiwork, that we should feel free to do so. By now, the island, the atoll, was pretty well under Marine control. So a few of us went ashore. And I, coming out of this world of clean starched khakis, first was assaulted by the smell of death, of dead bodies. We walked around. There were still a few Japanese there. We stopped at one place where there was a Marine, and I think he must have been a sergeant, bare-chested, with a samurai sword around his waist. And a private Marine was going in and out of a storeroom, and he came out with a box and opened it and said, "Oh, what are these?" And they were fuses. And he started to turn the fuses, and the sergeant stopped him promptly. The sergeant said, "Before we came here, we were told the Japs were itty-bitty guys." It turned out that the Japanese on Kwajalein were Imperial Marines, and they were anything but itty-bitty guys. And the sergeant described how he fired a burst of one and saw it hit, and the man kept on coming. And again, a burst of another one, and he kept on coming, and he finally gave him the whole thing. And thereafter, he gave the whole thing to anyone he fired at. We were given, what would it have been, C rations, K rations? I couldn't eat scrambled eggs for a long time without smelling that smell. That was quite a lot. Saipan. Saipan, more shooting. I think there were 40,000 Japanese on Saipan, and many civilian laborers, families. We bombarded as usual, and at night, evening, we would go out 50 miles or so and across 50 miles or so, and then come back 50 miles or so. Because we wanted to remain underway so that the Japanese could not clobber us. They were in communication with Iwo Jima, where there were Japanese aircraft, and presumably they were in communication with Japanese submarines. So after a night or three of that, Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner ordered all the ships to anchor. Our captain got on the phone and requested permission to remain underway. And Admiral Turner said, "God damn it, Captain, when I say anchor, I mean anchor." So we anchored. That evening after chow, I was in the junior officers' wardroom. We were just starting a bridge game. I had bid 4-no trump, which is about all I remember of bridge. And up on deck were the men looking at the island with the smoke rising and the gunfire and all. And one of them said, supposedly, "Hey, look at the B-26. And another one said, "That's no B-26, that's a Betty." Betty was the U.S. Navy's designation for a Japanese torpedo plane, torpedo bomber. And the first one said, "No, that's a B-26. Boom! The ship shuddered. Immediately, bells, bugles, all hands man at your battle station, close all watertight doors, and the usual. We all raced for our battle stations. And as I ran down to the main battery plotting room, I was debating with myself, what if it's a plane? What if it's a submarine? What if there's another one? What do I want to go down there for? Mm-hmm. And of course, I was there. It was a plane. The torpedo landed next to 5,000 gallons of high-octane fuel for our planes. Did not ignite, did not combust. The only fatalities we had, the only casualties we had, were 2 chief petty officers who were sleeping in their bunk room and overcome by gasoline fumes. Immediately we were detached, given a destroyer or escort. The torpedo wrecked the bow. The bow was held pretty much in place by the forecastle, by the top decks and supports. It was flapping like this. And we got underway and went slowly, I think 10 or 12 knots. And the next day, there was a brief burial ceremony. And the bodies were committed to the deep. And then the jazz band played. And everybody was saying, "Oh boy, back to Frisco to get a new bow." I never heard what happened with Richmond Kelly Turner and the captain and the ensuing investigation. I assume there was an investigation. I never learned anything more about that. We finally got back to Pearl. This was July 44. And our arrival coincided with that of President Roosevelt. He was there to meet with MacArthur and Halsey and Nimitz and King and the whole catastrophe. That's not my original line. That was from a movie. Anyway, President Roosevelt came to our ship. We loved President Roosevelt. Franklin D. Roosevelt was a Navy man. He'd been Assistant Secretary of the Navy in the 20s. And he was on the quarterdeck and surrounded by everybody. And he asked the superintendent of the Navy Yard, "What's going to happen to this ship, Admiral?" And the superintendent said, "She's going back to San Francisco, Mr. President, to get a new bow." "Oh, why don't you put a new bow on here?" And our hearts sunk. and the superintendent said, "Well, we've never done that with a vessel of this size, Mr. President." And he said, "Well, why don't you try?"
Yes, sir.
And so, bye-bye Frisco, and 34 days later, we had a new bow. The next, and for me, the last operation was Peleliu in the Palau Islands. And historians have written about this, how it really wasn't necessary. It could have been bypassed as other islands had been successfully. But it was so far ahead, so far along with the preparations that it supposedly went ahead. And it was a pretty grim operation for the poor guys who went ashore. Now, members of my class, I was in the class of 1944, who graduated in 43. Class of 44 were invited to put in for flight training. And I had put in for flight training and was accepted. And so after Peleliu, we went back to Manus, M-A-N-U-S, in the Admiralty Islands, where I left the ship. We arrived there a few days after an ammunition ship blew up, one of our ammunition ships. I cannot remember the name. was still very much in the war, in other words. I left the ship, the Maryland went on. I forgot, I must mention something. After Saipan and before Peleliu, I was moved up from being assistant fire control officer to the 1st Division, Turret 1 of 2 16-inch guns, to be division officer of Turret 1 of the 1st Division. So at Peleliu, my battle station was in the booth, the back of the turret, where the manual controls were. And when we were not firing, and when we were under air attack, for example, there was nothing for us to do. There was no air conditioning, and so we would keep the hatch in the back underneath the turret open, and we would sit around the hatch. There were 2 of them around the hatches to get fresh air, because there was nothing a 16-inch gun could do in any case. I learned later that the officer who took my place in Turret 1 was killed doing what I would have been doing along with the other men sitting around the hatch by a kamikaze. This was off Leyte. The plane, I was told, hit Turret 2, slid off, went under Turret 1, the overhang, the hatches, and blew up. This was about 6 weeks after I left the ship. So we fatalists considered me on borrowed time. Flight training. I was a terrible pilot. And in Ottumwa, Iowa, at the Naval Air Station, flight training began the 1st of November, 1944. The field was snowed in and iced in, and so when we learned to fly, it was on snow and ice, and thus landing and taking off, we never had to pay any attention to drift, to the wind, as we just slide in the direction we wanted to go. And the first day of a dry mat, when the snow and ice had all melted in the spring, there were many ground-looped airplanes, wrecked planes by my colleagues. I was not one of them, fortunately, who suddenly had to realize that you had to pay attention to wind.
What plane were you trained?
The plane was the Yellow Peril, the Stearman N2S, a plane that flew so well that it had to be fitted with a spoiler. It was a biplane. Had to be fitted with a spoiler on the front, on the leading edge of the wing, because if you went into a spin without the spoiler, you could not pull out of the spin. And so they generously gave us a spoiler. I was a very poor pilot. I made well, in the beginning, my instructor, whom I outranked by now, I was a Lieutenant JG, said, "John, you're expert at recovering from crash landings. How about making a good landing for a change?" So I did. And eventually he said, "Well, listen, I don't think you're going to get any better. Why don't you take her up by yourself?" That's how I soloed, with those encouraging words. when I got to sea stage, aerobatic so-called, I was making myself sick. And I talked to him, my instructor, what do you think? Because I was being given all of the time I needed. And he said, well, I've had guys worse than you get out there and become aces, and I've had guys who've been terrific here go out there and they wind up in the drink the first day they take off from a carrier. So with that encouraging word, I turned in my wings and said, I'd like to go back to ordnance and gunnery. I was sent to Washington, D.C. for an 8-week course at Goose, the Gunnery Officers Ordnance School, to learn all about the new semi-automatic 8-inch rifles. And so after Goose, I was ordered to the USS Argonne City with its new 8-inch semi-automatic rifles. Knowing all about them, I was put in charge of 5-inch guns. This was our Navy at its best. The Argonne City was a lovely ship. I think that of which I am most proud was this, that instead of the 2 Argonne cities, there was one in Oregon and the other in, I think, New Hampshire, for which the ship was named. Excuse me. Instead of the folks back home in those cities being asked to contribute to heavy silver teapots and silverware to go in the officers' boardroom, that they should be asked if we could use that money to make a studio, a sound studio for the ship. We got state-of-the-art recording equipment. In those days, the Armed Forces Radio sent out discs by celebrities who performed for people in the armed forces, and those were never put on sale. Those were just for us. And so I had the cooperation of the 2 Argonne cities and my captain and my executive officer. And we did indeed get the best sound equipment, and we would play music as we went over the bounding main when we weren't busy. We went to Guantanamo Bay. Well, we had our commissioning ceremony at the Quincy Navy Yard. The crew was in training at, in blocked, I can't think of Rhode Island. In any event, after commissioning and all, we went on our shakedown cruise to Guantanamo Bay, off Guantanamo Bay. Did our shooting, did everything else we needed to do, and we were in good shape. I then received orders to go to the USS Washington, was yet a newer old battleship, to take Naval Academy midshipmen on their summer cruise. So the circle was closing in a way. I was main battery plotting officer. During this time, I had applied, by now after Japan surrendered, I had applied to resign, to submit my resignation. I wanted to write and edit. I had an uncle who was a role model. I was trained for war, I had seen war, and I didn't feel I could be that useful anymore in the service. And so I submitted my resignation from time to time and never received my orders. That's summer of '46. I guess late summer, we came up to Annapolis Roads to disembark the midshipmen. And I had the weekend off, or a day off. I went into Washington to the temporary Navy buildings along the mall, which were those Quonset that were temporary, I think, for about 10 years. I went to the big ship's desk, and I asked the young man behind the desk, "Do you happen to have my orders here?" And he said, Leff, look in that file tray over there. So I looked in the file tray, and there was from the Chief of Naval Operations to Jonathan Leff, Lieutenant United States Navy, and then the whole thing. And at the end of page 1, it said, "And so you will report to," page 2, "the chief surgeon at the U.S. Naval Hospital in Quincy, Massachusetts, where you will become a junior surgeon." They had stapled my page 1 to some poor doctor's page 2. And if I hadn't come along and found this, I'd probably still be trying to get out. That's unfair.
Wow.
Now, after the Navy, the one other project involving the Navy, of which I'm particularly proud, is a book that I edited. I'd left the Navy. My first civilian job was as an assistant editor on 2 Hollywood movie fan magazines, which was quite a transition.
I would say so.
But I really wanted to be a newspaper man at that time. And I did get a job on a daily newspaper, the San Fernando Valley Times. And I should mention, just for the record, that during those few years, I had what I assume was a typical World War II marriage to, are you ready for this? A nightclub singer in Greenwich Village. Now, for this simple lad from Arizona, that was quite a deal. After I obtained a divorce in California, I went back to New York, where I worked in book publishing, magazines, and a port in a storm, public relations. My first book publishing job was at Henry Holt & Company.
Right.
And my association there with the Navy came in the form of a wonderful guy who was then a commander, Edward L. Beach, Ned Beach, who was a submariner, an eminent submariner, and he became a good friend. And the book that I edited, that he wrote and which I edited, was called Submarine. And there's a copy somewhere here.
Actually, Cheryl has it.
Because, well, it's not important at the moment because I know it by heart. He wrote in my copy, "To John Leff of Henry Holt, and once of the U.S. Navy, who knows more about this book than either he or I will ever admit." The book received rave reviews. The critics called it one of the great documentaries of World War II. So my association with it meant a lot to me all these years. I wish to mention one other thing that made my life the last 60 years wondrous. And that's my wife, Dolores Morin Leff, who died last September 4th, 2010, of liver cancer. And of course, my life has never been the same. What else should I talk about?
I'd like to ask you one question. We're speaking to people that may not even be born yet. What wisdom would you like to share with them about war, about direction of our country? What would you like to say to them, Jonathan?
Oh my. I'm 89 years old. Apparently, war is part of the human condition. Sadly. Sadly. There was a wonderful man named Judge Turkle, who was among the first to do oral histories along the lines, I guess, in a way, somewhat as we are doing. And one of his collections he called The Good War. And the Good War was World War II. And I consider that to have been a good war. I don't want to discuss any wars since then. Except to say, I think World War II was the last good war. And I'm glad I was able to participate in it. What else should I say?
That's all you need to say. Again, I'll speak for myself, my family, and I pray a silent majority of this nation. We thank you for your service.
Please. I'll add one other note, and I wasn't going to really talk about it. I participated in another war. From May 1948 through January 1949, I was a foreign volunteer with the Israeli Navy. Just for the record.
Thank you, John.
Thank you for allowing me to ventilate.